Hey guys, tonight we drift back to an age when the world still moved by coal smoke and telegrams. 1914, the summer the lights went out across Europe. You can almost hear the clatter of the Tokyo press rooms as typewriters hammer out a single, breathless headline. War in Europe. Steam whistles cry along Yokohama's docks. Merchants shout that the British Empire is mobilizing, and somewhere in the Imperial Palace, a quiet cabinet meeting is already deciding that Japan will not stay idle. You, a young naval cadet, stand on a balcony over the harbor watching masts sway like a forest of iron bamboo. The sea smells of fuel oil and ambition. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me down in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You breathe in the heavy August air, a mix of salt and new steel. Across the water, a battleship's hull gleams, Japan's promise to Britain under the 1902 Anglo-Japanese Alliance. When Britain fights, Japan is bound to lend a hand, at least in Asia, but no one says how much help. That ambiguity is where opportunity hides. Politicians see not a duty, but a stage. The German leasehold at Tsingtao, the Pacific Islands stretching from the Marshalls to the Carolines, little dots that could become stepping stones to an empire. A splendid chance, murmurs one cabinet minister, while another worries the West will accuse Japan of opportunism. Historians still argue whether Tokyo acted out of loyalty or calculation, but in the moment, excitement drowns out doubt. In the cafes of Ginza, students sip coffee and argue over maps torn from European newspapers. Someone points to Shandong and declares, half-jokingly, that Germany's colonial beer breweries there are reason enough for conquest. Another insists Japan must show it can fight beside the great powers, not merely copy them. You listen, wondering if glory ever tastes as good as it sounds. Out in the streets, factory whistles blow longer each morning. Dockyards that once built merchant steamers now rivet armor plates under banners reading, "For the Emperor, for the Alliance." The Navy, not the Army, buzzes with purpose. Admirals calculate how far their cruisers can range before coal supplies run low. The British Admiralty, overwhelmed by commitments in Europe, sends a polite cable. Could Japan please neutralize Germany's Far Eastern base? Within hours, Tokyo's newspapers trumpet it as an invitation to history. You can picture the scene in the Diet. Ministers fanning themselves against the heat, while reporters crowd the galleries. Prime Minister Okuma rises, white-bearded and slow-spoken, to announce Japan's ultimatum to Germany. Withdraw your ships from Chinese waters. Surrender Tsingtao. Everyone knows Berlin will ignore it. War is effectively declared. Crowds spill into Hibiya Park, waving flags. Someone hoists a banner that reads, "Let the rising sun shine over the Pacific." You, swept along, shout until your throat burns. You probably won't survive this, at least not as the same person. While Europe drowns in trench mud, Japan's conflict begins under bright eastern skies. Navy squadrons steam from Sasebo toward the Yellow Sea, destroyers slicing through swells flecked with flying fish. On deck, sailors gossip that the Germans have only a few thousand men in Tsingtao. Easy pickings, they say. Still, every gun is polished, every torpedo loaded. The Imperial Army contributes a token corps, but everyone knows this will be the Navy's show. At night, you stand watch beneath constellations mirrored in the water. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the German East Asia Squadron roams. A handful of cruisers under Admiral von Spee. He's the sort of name whispered with respect. His ships are ghosts appearing off Samoa one week, vanishing beyond Chile the next. Japan hunts him but finds only silence. "We're chasing smoke," grumbles your captain. Still, each chase trains navigators, radio operators, and stokers in ways no peacetime drill ever could. It's the first time Japanese warships coordinate across thousands of nautical miles, guided by radio codebooks thicker than any novel. Back home, Families gather around newspaper extras plastered with red headlines. The phrase expeditionary force enters daily vocabulary. The emperor's portrait appears beside that of King George V, a symbolic handshake between East and West. Children memorize a new patriotic song whose chorus rhymes Britain with rising sun. The lyricist stretched hard for that one. The general mood? Cautious pride mixed with curiosity. Ordinary citizens barely understand why their sons are fighting Germans they'll never see. But factories hum, exports surge, and the yen begins its long climb. Meanwhile, the German garrison at Tsingtao braces behind concrete and barbed wire, determined to make a stand worthy of European honor. They nickname themselves the Lions of the East. From their fortress walls, they can see Japanese troop transports crawling along the coast. The siege will last 2 months, short by Western standards but momentous for Japan. Its first coordinated land-sea campaign outside the home islands. Engineers design narrow-gauge railways overnight. Sappers dig trenches so straight they resemble origami folds in the earth. You help unload artillery shells stamped "Made in Sheffield," a reminder that the alliance runs on trade as much as trust. One humid morning, a rumor spreads through camp. The Germans have mounted aircraft for reconnaissance. Airplanes! You squint upward at a distant speck, buzzing like an angry wasp. Moments later, Japanese seaplanes roar off from makeshift pontoons to give chase. Somewhere above Shandong, East Asia witnesses its first aerial dogfight. Awkward, brief, and mostly missed by everyone except one astonished goat herder who later swears the machines fought like dragons. Historians still debate whether that counts as Japan's first air battle, but the legend sticks. When the fortress finally falls in November 1914, it's less from bombardment than exhaustion. The Germans march out in neat ranks, their flags folded. Japanese officers salute them, a gesture that surprises Allied observers who expected gloating. Yet behind the courtesy lies calculation. Prisoners are valuable bargaining chips. Japan sends them to camps near Kurume and Nagoya, where they'll end up teaching locals how to bake bread and play Beethoven. One even opens a noodle stall after the war. History, it turns out, has a sense of humor. Back in Tokyo, victory bells ring. The press declares Japan a trustworthy member of civilization. The British send flowery telegrams of gratitude. You smile at the praise, but notice how they still call your country useful. Useful allies get thanked. Equal partners get consulted. The distinction gnaws at you, though you can't yet name why. By winter's first chill, Japan's navy controls former German islands scattered across the Central Pacific. Maps in schoolrooms are hastily redrawn, red circles replacing German crosses. Somewhere, a teacher points at those dots and tells children, these are Japan's necklace of pearls. Few realize those same pearls will, decades later, form the route to Pearl Harbor. For now, it feels like destiny fulfilled. You lean on the ship's rail one last time, watching the horizon blush with sunrise. The war, distant as it began, has become Japan's proving ground. Factories, fleets, diplomacy, all tested and sharpened. Yet beneath the triumph lingers a quiet unease. If this small taste of global power feels intoxicating, what happens when Japan wants more? No one asks aloud. The waves murmur, the brass gleams, and somewhere deep inside you sense that the story has only begun. You wake again to the faint creak of ship masts and the low hum of generators powering telegraphs across the Pacific. The date on the calendar reads 1902, more than a decade before the guns of Europe thunder. You're back at the beginning, when Japan first signed its fateful alliance with Britain. At the time, it didn't seem like the dawn of empire. It felt more like the polite handshake of two nations with matching anxieties. Britain feared Russian expansion into Asia, and Japan, still tasting the memory of Commodore Perry's black ships, feared being left behind in a world carved up by colonial appetites. The Anglo-Japanese Alliance was elegant in its simplicity. If either power was attacked by two or more countries, the other would come to its aid. One enemy meant sympathy. Two enemies meant war. It was a lawyer's kind of friendship, conditional, cautious, but revolutionary nonetheless. You can almost picture the ink drying on the treaty, the diplomats congratulating each other in overly formal English and archaic Japanese, both sides pretending this was about peace rather than convenience. For Japan, it was validation. The country that just 50 years earlier had been a feudal archipelago now stood acknowledged by the world's greatest naval empire. The streets of Tokyo erupted in celebration. Newspapers printed cartoons of samurai shaking hands with British admirals, the rising sun blending with the Union Jack. And somewhere in those pages, you can see the birth of a dangerous idea that Japan's future lay not in humility, but in parity. Over the next decade, the alliance reshaped Japan's identity. The Meiji era's slogan, "Rich country, strong army," found its maritime extension, "Strong country, greater navy." British advisors trained Japanese officers, shared blueprints, even helped design battleships like the Mikasa, the pride of the imperial fleet. If you squint, you can still see her anchored in Yokosuka today, a floating relic of ambition dressed as progress. You sit on her deck in your mind, smelling the tar and gunmetal. The brass fittings gleam like the future itself. Japanese sailors learned gunnery techniques from British manuals, their fingers tracing unfamiliar English words like broadside and starboard. The sense of partnership runs deep enough that when the Russo-Japanese War erupts in 1904, London watches Japan's victory at Tsushima with both awe and relief. The alliance, it turns out, was a good investment. Still, not everyone in Britain was comfortable with this Eastern partner. Some in Parliament muttered about the Yellow Peril, even while applauding Japan's naval prowess. Hypocrisy travels well across oceans. Yet, to Tokyo, those murmurs were merely noise compared to the symphony of pride swelling at home. Japan had beaten a European empire and emerged a global power. The alliance had done its job. It had opened the door to the world stage. Historians still argue whether the Anglo-Japanese Alliance was born out of genuine respect or pure self-interest. Realistically, it was both. Britain got a watchful guard dog in the Pacific. Japan got legitimacy and a seat at the grown-ups table. You could say it was an arranged marriage that somehow worked. At least for a while. As you wander through early 1910s Tokyo, the alliance's influence lingers in subtle ways. Western architecture sprouts among Shinto shrines. The Imperial Navy's uniforms mimic the Royal Navy's cut and color. British phrases slip into the military lexicon. "Aye, aye, sir" sounds oddly charming in a Kansai accent. Tokyo's streets hum with imported motor cars, phonographs, and a growing confidence that Japan's destiny extends far beyond its volcanic shores. But alliances are tricky things. They shape not just strategy, but self-perception. Japan begins to see itself as the guardian of order in East Asia, much like Britain fancies itself the steward of global civilization. That's the problem with sitting beside an empire. You start thinking like one. And so, when 1914 arrives and the telegrams fly about Archduke Franz Ferdinand's assassination, Japan's leaders don't ask whether they should join the war. They ask how soon. You imagine that smoky cabinet room again. Prime Minister Okuma and Foreign Minister Kato huddled under portraits of the Meiji Emperor. Britain's formal request hasn't even arrived yet, but they already sense their opportunity. "If we act swiftly," Kato says, "we can strike Germany before anyone else moves." The word strike hangs in the air like the blade of a katana waiting to drop. The alliance technically requires action only if Britain is attacked by multiple powers, but clever interpretation is a Japanese specialty. Kato argues that supporting Britain now will cement the partnership and secure naval supremacy in Asia. Others whisper that it could also yield something tangible, Germany's prized possessions in the Pacific. The Caroline Islands, the Marshalls, the Marianas, they're unguarded, ripe for the taking. You lean back and think, so this is how expansion begins. Not with thunderous speeches, but with quiet logic wrapped in politeness. By late August 1914, Japan's declaration of war on Germany is official. British diplomats send cautious thanks, while German newspapers sneer at treacherous Orientals. But for the Japanese public, it's vindication. The alliance that began in ink now demands proof in steel. The Imperial Navy mobilizes, its ships bearing the twin flags of the rising sun and the white ensign. At Sasebo, officers toast to victory using imported Scotch whiskey, an irony lost on none of them. As your ship pulls out of harbor, the sailors cheer, yet beneath the jubilation lies something deeper, the sense that Japan is finally being taken seriously. You glance at the horizon and wonder whether they realize that this validation will come at a price. Alliances with empires have a way of turning apprentices into rivals. The fleet steams south toward Shandong. It's the first large-scale projection of Japanese naval power beyond the home islands. Wireless operators trade encoded messages with British headquarters in Hong Kong, their Morse code tapping like rain on metal. On deck, the Admiral's flag flutters against a sky tinted with the pink haze of dusk. The sea feels endless, but you can sense the magnetic pull of history tightening. Somewhere below deck, a sailor sketches in his notebook, a small doodle of Britannia shaking hands with Amaterasu, goddess of the sun. It's naive and beautiful, but you can't help smirking. In time, those two figures will turn their backs on each other. For now, though, the alliance still feels sacred. Night falls and you hear the rhythmic grind of the engines below. The smell of coal smoke clings to your clothes. A British observer on board compliments the Japanese discipline, noting that their decks are so clean, you could eat supper off them. The Japanese commander smiles politely, knowing the compliment carries a trace of condescension. Still, partnership requires patience. Above you, stars scatter across the sky. The same ones guiding British sailors around the Cape and Japanese fishermen along Hokkaido's coast. In that vastness, you realize how fragile alliances really are. Mere agreements scribbled beneath the infinite. Yet for this moment in 1914, the partnership shines bright. Two empires, one old and one rising, sailing side by side into a war that neither truly understands. You rest your hands on the railing and listen to the sea hiss against the hull. You wonder what the treaty's authors would think if they could see how their inked promises have led to this, the prelude to sieges, demands, and rivalries that will shape the century. You suspect they'd raise a glass and call it progress, and maybe, in some tragic way, they'd be right. The horizon smells of salt and gunpowder as you lean over the deck rail, watching gray waves roll toward the Shandong Peninsula. The sea has lost its romance. Now it feels like a waiting room before history begins. You're part of Japan's first major wartime expedition abroad, bound for the German stronghold at Tsingtao, a name that tastes foreign, like the beer brewed there. The brass pipes below hiss with steam as sailors polish guns until they gleam like mirrors of ambition. You're not alone. Beside the Imperial Japanese Navy sail two British warships, Triumph and Uplift, their Union Jacks flapping against the coastal wind. The British presence is mostly ceremonial. Everyone knows the Japanese will handle the heavy lifting. Britain's navy is tied up in Europe, fighting for survival in the North Sea. Here in the Far East, the Empire's hopes ride on the disciplined crews of the rising sun. You feel a strange pride. Japan, once the student, now taking the lead while its old mentor watches from the sidelines. Tsingtao, or Qingdao as the locals call it, isn't just a port. It's the jewel of Germany's Pacific Empire, complete with modern docks, railways, and villas with steep European roofs that look absurd against the Chinese landscape. The Germans built it as a model colony, part science experiment, part boast. Its bay, Jiaozhou, curves like a protective arm, and its hills bristle with artillery. Inside those hills are German soldiers, veterans of Africa and Europe, now stranded thousands of miles from home. You arrive under gray skies that seem painted by an indecisive artist, neither stormy nor calm. The Japanese fleet drops anchor, and landing parties gather on deck, rifles slung, bayonets glinting. You hear a British officer remark, half joking, "Don't forget, gentlemen, they brew the best beer in Asia down there." The Japanese commander nods solemnly, "Then we shall drink it in victory." The siege begins in late September 1914. Japanese engineers unload narrow-gauge rails, assembling them with the precision of clockmakers. Every day the trenches creep closer to the fortress, neat and measured, like handwriting across a page. You can almost hear the rhythm of shovels striking earth. Thunk. Pause. Thunk. As thousands of soldiers carve their approach toward the German lines. From the ridge, you see flashes of fire as Japanese batteries open up. The shells scream across the sky, exploding among the German defenses. The echoes roll over the hills, mixing with the low drone of aircraft engines. Yes, aircraft. Japan's first real use of them in combat. They're primitive seaplanes, launched from makeshift rafts, more experimental than lethal. One wobbles overhead like a dragonfly, and you swear you can hear the pilot cursing the wind in frustration. Still, it's enough to make the Germans duck. Historians still argue whether this was the first true naval-air cooperation in history, but for Japan, it's a preview of a century yet to come. Down in the trenches, soldiers scrawl haikus on scraps of paper. One reads, "Autumn cannon smoke. My tea grows cold, untouched still. Home feels far away." There's poetry, even in mud. As days drag on, the siege becomes routine. Artillery by day, mosquitoes by night. The Germans, though heavily outnumbered, fight like cornered wolves. They've dug tunnels, laid mines, and built overlapping fields of fire. Their commander, Alfred Meyer Waldeck, swears he'll hold out until the last shell. You respect him for that, though you secretly hope he runs out of ammunition soon. Back in Tokyo, newspapers call this campaign the proof of Japan's modern power. Artists sketch heroic scenes that bear little resemblance to the mud-caked reality. Mothers visit shrines and tie paper prayers for sons they imagine marching through glorious battlefields instead of rice paddies and rain. Then, on a cold morning in early November, the siege reaches its crescendo. The bombardment shakes the very earth. You stand behind a line of heavy guns as the order comes. All batteries, fire. The air turns into a storm of smoke and thunder. When the echoes fade, the fortress is silent. A white flag rises over the hills of Tsingtao like a ghost surrendering at dawn. Japanese officers march into the city under a sky that suddenly looks too blue for war. The streets smell of smoke and malt. The brewery is still intact. German prisoners line up in formation, hats off, saluting their conquerors. There's mutual respect here, even admiration. You can see it in the brief nod exchanged between the opposing commanders. "A fine defense," the Japanese general murmurs, "worthy of soldiers." Among the ruins, local Chinese civilians peek from doorways, uncertain whether to cheer or flee. To them, one foreign master has replaced another. You can't blame their caution. Japan promises to restore order, but you notice how quickly its flags go up on every public building. That night, you explore the captured city. The German architecture feels eerie in its emptiness. Church spires, stone villas, manicured gardens now illuminated by Japanese lanterns. A few sailors break into song. Someone finds a barrel of beer, and laughter ripples through the courtyard. You sip from a tin cup, the bitter taste oddly grounding. For a brief moment, victory feels simple, but simplicity never lasts. The next morning, officers begin cataloging trophies, guns, documents, and land deeds. Tsingtao will remain under Japanese administration, which sounds temporary, but isn't. You overhear an officer joke, Occupation is like love. It's never meant to last, yet it always does. You chuckle, then stop. Something about it feels too true. The official casualty count is modest. Fewer than 1,000 Japanese dead, a fraction of Europe's daily losses. Yet to Japan, the moral weight is immense. It proves to the world that an Asian power can fight and win on modern terms. Western observers admit it grudgingly. British newspapers call Japan's effort efficient, though overzealous. You know what they mean. Effective, but unsettling. One quirky rumor spreads among the troops. Some claim that during the bombardment, a German band played The Watch on the Rhine while shells exploded around them. Others say it was Auld Lang Syne. Historians still argue which tune it was, if any. But the image endures. Brave men saluting the end of an empire with music. When you sail home weeks later, the sea feels calmer, the air lighter. The fleet arrives in triumph. Flags flutter from every mast. School children wave as bands play Kimi ga Yo. You watch the smiling faces, the confetti, the imperial banners. Everyone sees victory. Only a few glimpse the shadow it casts. Because with every triumph comes expectation. Japan has shown it can conquer, so what now? You overhear a senior officer mutter, "If the Allies carve up the world after this war, we must claim our share." It sounds pragmatic, not arrogant, but ambition rarely sounds dangerous at first. As your ship docks at Sasebo, you breathe in the smell of home, cooked rice, cedar, coal. Yet something feels altered. The men disembark taller, prouder, eyes sharper, with the knowledge of what they've done. They've seen a world beyond Japan's shores and realized how small and big it all is. On the dock, a young boy tugs his father's sleeve and asks, "Papa, does this mean we're as strong as the British now?" The father laughs, not answering. You can almost hear the echo of that question rolling forward through the decades. The war in Europe rages on, but for Japan, Tsingtao is only the opening act. The taste of victory lingers, sweet, intoxicating, and just a little dangerous. The chill of early winter clings to your coat as you step off the gangplank and onto the battered docks of Tsingtao. The guns have fallen silent, but the smell of cordite still floats on the sea breeze, a sour, metallic tang that never quite leaves. The siege is over, yet its echoes linger in the cracked walls and blackened hills. You follow the procession of officers through the ruins, boots crunching on shattered glass. The rising sun flag flutters over the former German governor's mansion, its bright red circle glaring against the pale European facade. You look around and realize something unsettling. For the first time, Japan isn't fighting for survival. It's fighting for territory. This isn't another defense of the homeland. It's conquest. And with conquest comes administration, paperwork, supply lines, and all the invisible machinery of empire. You can almost hear the pens scratching inside those newly claimed offices. The Japanese soldiers who fought here are already being hailed as heroes. Yet the victory feels oddly sterile. There are no grand parades, no emotional homecomings, just quiet efficiency. The imperial staff set about reorganizing the city, renaming streets, and drafting reports for Tokyo. Somewhere in the background, a band plays the Kimi ga Yo, its notes drifting across the harbor like incense. You think of how far this once feudal nation has come, and how quickly it's learning the empire's old tricks. In the city's brewery, once the pride of German industry, Japanese engineers inspect copper vats and fermentation tanks. Within weeks, the beer will be flowing again, rebranded under new management. The factory foreman jokes, "We've taken their fortress and their flavor." The men laugh, and you realize conquest tastes a lot like commerce. But outside the city walls, the Chinese countryside hums with tension. Peasants watch Japanese patrols march past their fields, unsure whether to bow or turn away. They had endured decades of German rule, and now a new set of uniforms has arrived. Better one foreign devil than another, an old man mutters in the dialect of Shandong. His grandson, Boulder, asks what happens when this devil stays too long. You have no answer. In Tokyo, news of victory spreads like wildfire. Newspapers print heroic sketches of soldiers silhouetted against explosions, while editorialists praise the alliance with Britain as proof that Japan now stands among the civilized nations. For ordinary citizens, the word civilized feels intoxicating. For the elites, it's a ticket into global politics. Still, beneath the celebrations, there's unease. The army resents the Navy's glory. The bureaucrats squabble over how to manage the captured territory. Foreign Minister Kato insists Japan must hold Tsingtao until proper international arrangements are made. That's polite diplomacy for "we're keeping it." Historians still argue whether Japan ever intended to return it, but judging by the new railways already under construction, the answer seems clear. You spend the winter there, watching the city transform. German street signs come down, Japanese merchants move in, and new schools teach both kanji and cautious nationalism. The occupation isn't brutal, it's bureaucratic. Yet each small act of control plants a deeper root. One night, you overhear two officers talking on a balcony. The Germans proved you can rule Asia through efficiency, one says. Now we'll prove we can do it better. You sip your tea, pretending not to listen. But the words burn hotter than the drink. Beyond Shandong, the ripples of Japan's victory reach distant islands scattered across the Pacific. In swift, almost effortless operations, the Imperial Navy seizes Germany's Micronesian colonies, the Marshalls, the Carolines, the Marianas. Hardly a shot is fired. The few German administrators surrender with dignified relief, glad to avoid another hopeless siege. Japan plants flags on coral beaches and photographs officers standing proudly beside local chiefs. The images appear in Tokyo newspapers under headlines like "Guardians of the Pacific." You imagine those officers feeling the same quiet thrill you felt entering Tsingtao. The intoxicating sense of being watched by history itself. Out here, thousands of kilometers from home, Japan's Navy sails where only European fleets once ruled. Every anchorage, every coaling station becomes a stepping stone towards something larger, a Pacific empire, though no one dares use the word empire just yet. At night, sailors gather on deck beneath the vast dome of stars, mapping constellations that will guide future ambitions. Some talk about duty, others talk about opportunity. A petty officer jokes that the Pacific Islands are just waiting for telegraph poles and karaoke bars. Everyone laughs, though none of them know what karaoke is yet. It hasn't been invented. You chuckle at the irony from your vantage in the future. Back in Europe, few pay attention to these faraway conquests. The trenches of France and Flanders swallow millions. The world's focus is fixed on the Western Front. But in the background, quietly and efficiently, Japan is rewriting the map of the Pacific. When word finally reaches London of Japan's lightning seizures, the reaction is mixed. The Admiralty is grateful. Fewer German bases means safer Allied shipping. But the Foreign Office is uneasy. Our friends are very efficient, one British diplomat remarks dryly. Perhaps a bit too efficient. The Americans, meanwhile, begin to frown. They see Japan's moves as encroachment on their own Pacific interests. The seeds of suspicion are planted, tiny, invisible, yet destined to grow tall. You, meanwhile, can't shake the feeling that something has shifted in Japan's soul. Victory has turned into appetite. The government justifies each new acquisition as strategic necessity, the same phrase European powers have used for centuries. The words sound civilized enough to hide their greed. Spring returns to Tsingtao, and cherry blossoms bloom among German villas. The streets hum with the mixed chatter of Japanese soldiers, Chinese laborers, and the occasional bewildered German prisoner assigned to rebuild the harbor. You pass one man sketching in charcoal. He's drawing Mount Lao in the distance, its slopes dotted with shrines. "Home is somewhere behind that mountain," he says in halting Japanese. You nod. you both understand that homes can move without notice. As the first anniversary of the victory approaches, Japan hosts parades in every major city. Children wave miniature flags. Bands play martial tunes adapted from European marches. The emperor reviews troops with serene detachment, his expression unreadable as ever. Yet behind that calm gaze lies a new confidence. Japan has proven its worth in battle, and the world must now treat it as an equal. At least, that's the dream. But equality is a slippery prize. Western diplomats still talk down to Japanese envoys, addressing them with patronizing courtesy. In private, some European officers call Japan useful Orientals. You hear the phrase repeated in Tokyo's clubs, sometimes by Japanese themselves, half in jest, half in resentment. That resentment will ferment quietly, like the beer once brewed in Tsingtao's cellars. Before you leave, you climb the fortress hill one last time. The city below glows with lamps, its harbor calm and silver under the moon. The breeze carries the mingled scents of the sea, fresh bread, and diesel oil. You realize this small corner of China has become a mirror, showing Japan not what it is, but what it wishes to be. Powerful, respected, modern, and a little bit feared. You close your eyes and listen to the surf rolling against the breakwater. The guns are silent now, but their echoes whisper something only you can hear. Once you begin building empires, you don't stop. You just change their shape. You awaken to the rumble of a ship's engines somewhere in the South Seas, the air thick with salt and heat. Palm fronds rustle on a distant shore, and the deck beneath your feet smells of tar and sweat. The war has widened, but out here in the Pacific, it feels strangely calm, an empire quietly rearranging itself while Europe burns. The Imperial Navy has turned from siege warfare to something more daring, a grand scavenger hunt across the ocean, sweeping up the remnants of Germany's island possessions. From the bridge of your cruiser, you watch coral atolls rise from turquoise water like shattered emeralds. The Marshalls, the Carolines, the Marianas, names that sound poetic, almost innocent. Yet every one of them once flew the German flag. Now they fly the rising sun. Japan moves quickly before anyone else can stake a claim. It's not conquest by battle this time, but by presence. You simply arrive first, plant your flag, and let distance do the rest. The Germans stationed here hardly resist. A handful of colonial officers, weary and cut off from Berlin, surrender with formal dignity. One, a balding bureaucrat with a walrus mustache, insists on reading aloud his resignation before handing over the keys to the radio tower. The Japanese commander listens patiently, nodding, then orders tea to be served. A strange politeness hangs in the humid air, like two chess players agreeing that the game is already decided. The islands themselves are beautiful and deceptive. You step ashore on coral sand so white it hurts your eyes, surrounded by coconut trees and curious islanders. The locals, dressed in woven skirts, peer at the newcomers with a mix of awe and suspicion. They've seen flags change before, and they know the pattern. First come sailors, then soldiers, then taxes. Japan calls this new territory the Nanyo Gunto, the South Seas Mandate. Officially, it's temporary. Occupation until peace returns. Unofficially, it's a blueprint for expansion. The Navy builds weather stations, coaling depots, and radio outposts. Each island becomes a bead on a growing necklace stretching across the Pacific. Historians still argue whether the Navy foresaw how valuable these islands would become in future wars, but you suspect they knew exactly what they were doing. At night, the tropical air hums with cicadas as you sit on the deck, looking up at a sky stitched with stars. The constellations seem closer here, as if the heavens themselves are leaning down to watch. A sailor strums a shamisen and sings a ballad about home. The tune sounds soft and lonely, almost out of place in paradise. You close your eyes and imagine the neon streets of Tokyo, the noise of trams, the smell of ramen. Out here, everything feels distant and unreal, like a dream you're not sure you'll wake from. One morning, you visit an old German trading post on Yap Island, now staffed by Japanese administrators. They're cataloging everything: coconut plantations, phosphate mines, shipping ledgers. Every empire begins with inventory, one clerk jokes, waving a dusty ledger. He's not wrong. Empire, you realize, is just paperwork with better lighting. The British send polite congratulations. The Americans, however, begin to frown. Washington's newspapers warn that Japan's control of the Central Pacific gives it a dangerous foothold near American trade routes. To you, it feels ironic. After all, Japan is still fighting on the Allied side. But war changes perceptions faster than diplomacy can soothe them. You overhear a naval officer mutter, "They cheer when we help them and panic when we succeed." He's right, and that resentment will only grow. One afternoon, a squall sweeps in from the east. Rain lashes the deck, wind howls through rigging, and visibility drops to nothing. You grip the railing, soaked but exhilarated. When it passes, the sky clears into a brilliant orange sunset. Somewhere below, dolphins leap beside the ship as if escorting it toward destiny. You think to yourself that the sea never really belongs to anyone. It just allows visitors. But nations are bad at listening to lessons from the sea. Back in Japan, the newspapers call these conquests peaceful occupations. Maps are redrawn, with the empire's new possessions marked as protective zones, not colonies. It's a clever distinction. The government insists Japan is merely safeguarding stability in the Pacific. But the artists illustrating those maps can't help themselves. They draw the islands with rays of sunlight spreading outward from the home islands, as though the ocean itself is bowing. You return briefly to Tokyo to find the city humming with pride. Shop windows display globes with Japan's new territories highlighted in bright crimson. School children recite patriotic poems about sailors conquering storms. The Navy's victories have made the sea feel smaller, more domestic. Suddenly, Japan doesn't seem like an isolated island nation. It feels like the center of a widening world. Yet not everyone shares the enthusiasm. In smoky university cafes, young intellectuals debate what this expansion means. Some say it's the natural reward for modernization. Others warn that Japan is copying the very imperialism it once despised. "We are learning to rule," one student says, but not learning to question why. You linger at the edge of their conversation, wondering who will be proven right. Meanwhile, the army looks enviously at the Navy's triumphs. The generals mutter that ships win headlines, but soldiers win nations. They want their share of glory, and their eyes turn inland, to China. You can sense the brewing rivalry between sea and land, modernist and traditionalist, admiral and general. It's a rivalry that will one day tear Japan's soul in two. For now, though, the empire glows with confidence. Trade surges, factories hum. The islands yield coconuts, phosphate, and pride. Telegraph cables extend Japan's voice across half the Pacific. You see the country's merchants, politicians, and officers united by a single, intoxicating belief that Japan's rise is both earned and inevitable. One curious footnote lingers in your mind. On one of the captured islands, Japanese scientists begin studying tropical medicine, malaria, dengue, even soil microbes. Their reports are meticulous, full of diagrams and Latin names. One day, those same researchers will contribute to Japan's industrial and military might. Others will take their knowledge into darker fields. History, like the tide, brings gifts and wreckage together. As 1915 approaches, Japan stands at a crossroads. The empire has doubled its overseas holdings with barely any bloodshed. The Navy has proven itself global, efficient, and ambitious. Yet ambition, once awakened, is hard to lull back to sleep. You think of those coral islands again, so small on a map yet enormous in implication. You lean against the ship's rail as it sails homeward. the Pacific stretching endlessly before you. The sunset fades into violet, and the first stars appear. You can't help smiling at the irony. The war meant to preserve the world order has just given birth to new ones. The ocean whispers around the hull, and you hear in its rhythm the faint murmur of what's to come. An empire that will one day reach too far, and a sea that will remember everything. You stand once again in the grand chambers of Beijing, 1915. The air smells of ink, sandalwood, and political tension thick enough to taste. A Japanese diplomat straightens his gloves before entering the hall, carrying a slim folder that contains something more explosive than any artillery shell: the 21 demands. Outside, the city bustles as usual. Rickshaws clatter over stone streets. Vendors shout over the hum of the crowd. Yet behind those ordinary noises hums a quieter fear. China has been fractured since the fall of the Qing dynasty. Its provinces ruled by ambitious warlords and uncertain governments. The new republic is fragile, and Japan knows it. You can sense the opportunism in the air, that sweet, dangerous scent that powerful nations detect when a neighbor is weak. The 21 demands are a masterpiece of polite imperialism, wrapped in diplomatic phrasing and tied with the ribbon of mutual friendship. On paper, they look like an alliance proposal. In reality, they're a wish list for domination. The demands cover everything: control of German possessions in Shandong, new mining and railway rights in Manchuria, special privileges in South China, and a clause that would turn China's police, trade, and advisors into puppets under Japanese oversight. You imagine the meeting, the Japanese envoy, polite to the point of cruelty, reading each demand slowly while the Chinese ministers fidget behind teacups. One official coughs, another wipes sweat from his brow though it's midwinter. When the final demand is read, the silence that follows feels like the moment before a thunderclap. Surely, the envoy says softly, these requests are modest. You can almost hear the restrained fury in the room. Modest, he says, but the list is a blueprint for a protectorate. It's an act of economic strangulation disguised as partnership. Still, what choice does China have? Its army is divided, its coffers drained, and the Western powers are too busy killing each other in Europe to intervene. President Yuan Shikai, a man equal parts opportunist and survivor, stalls for time. He leaks parts of the proposal to foreign embassies, hoping international outrage will save him. For once, it does. In Washington, Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan frowns over the telegrams. America, though neutral in the war, sees Japan's actions as a threat to its open-door policy, that comforting fiction that everyone should trade freely with China without carving it into pieces. The British and French, preoccupied with trench warfare, still send polite reminders to Tokyo. Perhaps a lighter hand, old friend. Historians still debate whether Japan overplayed its hand out of arrogance or insecurity. Some say Tokyo wanted to test how far it could push. Others argue it was trying to preempt German or Russian influence. Either way, the gamble backfires spectacularly. When the demands become public, the backlash is immediate and fierce. Across China, students boycott Japanese goods. Posters appear overnight. Refuse Japanese products. Save the nation. In Shanghai's markets, merchants pour Japanese sake into the gutter as crowds cheer. The boycott spreads faster than any army could march. For the first time in years, China finds unity not through government, but through indignation. You walk the streets of Beijing as the protests swell. Banners flutter, drums beat. Even rickshaw pullers join in, shouting slogans they barely understand, but feel in their bones. The humiliation of past decades, the opium wars, the unequal treaties, all condense into this one moment. A country on its knees suddenly finds its voice again. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, confusion reigns. The government hadn't expected this level of outrage. Newspapers that once praised the empire's progress now question its moral compass. "We are winning abroad," one editorial laments, but losing the world's respect. You can feel the sting behind those words. Japan, the nation that had fought to prove itself civilized, now looks like just another imperial bully. The compromise that follows is messy. Japan withdraws the most aggressive demands, the ones that would have made China effectively a colony, but keeps the rest. It still gains influence in Shandong and Manchuria, still extends its economic reach, still gets what it came for. On paper, it looks like a diplomatic retreat. In reality, it's a quiet victory wrapped in bad publicity. In private, Japanese officials call it a lesson learned. Publicly, they insist it was all misunderstood. "We only sought cooperation," they claim. Cooperation, of course, always sounds nicer when you're the one writing the terms. You spend a restless night in a Beijing boarding house, listening to rain against the shutters. The city feels wounded, but awake, like a patient emerging from anesthesia. The whispers in the tea houses have changed tone, no longer defeatist, but defiant. "China will rise again," someone says, and the others nod. You sense something has shifted that no treaty can undo. Humiliation has transformed into resolve. The next morning, a newspaper cartoon catches your eye. It shows Japan as a giant octopus draped across China, its tentacles labeled railways, loans, mines, and factories. It's crude but effective. You almost laugh, but the image stays with you. It's strange how ink on paper can wound deeper than bullets. Back in Japan, the mood is complicated. The economy is booming from wartime trade. Exports of silk, cotton, and munitions have made merchants rich. But international opinion is sour, and resentment simmers at home. Some intellectuals worry Japan is becoming what it once hated, an imitator of Western greed. Others shrug and say this is simply how great powers behave. If we don't expand, one nationalist pamphlet argues, we will be devoured. The phrase spreads like wildfire. Expand or be devoured. It sounds practical, even patriotic, and that's what makes it dangerous. At a dinner in Tokyo, you sit near an admiral who stirs his miso soup thoughtfully before saying, "The West respects only strength. If we show hesitation, we will end up like China." The table falls silent. Everyone nods. Fear and pride mix easily in this new Japan, each feeding the other like wind feeding flame. Yet there's a quieter Japan too. The scholars, artists, and workers who look at this growing imperial swagger and feel uneasy. A poet named Ishikawa writes, "We build ships of iron and hearts of paper." The line spreads in whispers, censored but unforgettable. Historians still argue about the real impact of the 21 demands. Some see it as a diplomatic blunder that alienated friends and united enemies. Others view it as Japan's first open rehearsal for the empire to come, the moment it stopped pretending to be Europe's student and began trying to replace its teacher. You suspect both are true. By summer's end, the crisis cools, but the world has changed. China distrusts Japan now more than ever. The United States begins to watch the Pacific with new suspicion. Britain, Japan's oldest ally, starts to wonder whether it's created a rival. You leave Beijing aboard a northbound train, the countryside sliding past in muted greens. Farmers bend over flooded fields, oblivious to the diplomacy playing out in capitals. Empires rise and fall, but rice still needs planting. The clatter of the rails lulls you into a strange calm. You think of the word demand. It's such a small word, but it carries the weight of ambition, hunger, and pride, and the echo of all that will follow. As the train rattles through the night, you glimpse a red sun breaking through the clouds, reflected in the flooded paddies like a warning painted in water. You tell yourself it's just the dawn, but part of you knows it's something else, the first flicker of a fire that will one day consume the world. You find yourself walking through the narrow streets of Shanghai in the spring of 1915. The air is damp and electric, the kind of humidity that clings to your skin like silk and smog. Posters line the walls, their red ink bleeding from the rain. Refuse the Japanese. Buy Chinese. In shop windows, Japanese goods sit untouched, gathering dust like guilty secrets. A boycott is not just an act of protest now. It's a movement, a pulse that beats through the city's veins. You pass a tea house filled with students, their eyes bright and furious. They're scribbling manifestos by candlelight, words tumbling faster than the ink can dry. "Our ancestors gave us the land," one of them shouts, "and now we trade it for rice and shame." The crowd roars approval. You can feel the tremor of nationalism rising, a sleeping giant shifting beneath centuries of humiliation. Japan's 21 demands have done something no emperor or warlord could. They've made the Chinese agree on something. Across the Pacific, the world is watching. American newspapers run cartoons of Japan with claws stretched over Asia, while British diplomats whisper uneasily that their ally might be developing an appetite. Japan's ambassador in Washington writes back in frustration. "They misunderstand us. We are not conquerors, we are modernizers." But modernization, you realize, looks different from the receiving end of a treaty. In Tokyo, the news of the boycott lands like a slap. Government officials insist it's just temporary anger, but merchants panic as Chinese orders collapse. Textile shipments sit idle, warehouses overflow, and the fragile pride of Japan's industrial boom starts to wobble. You walk past the Ginza markets, once packed with imported silks and European perfumes, now half empty and eerily quiet. The same businessmen who toasted economic destiny months earlier now curse the foreign ministry under their breath. A sense of unease creeps through the capital. The public, once euphoric about victory in Tsingtao and the Pacific, now feels the sting of moral isolation. The Western newspapers that had once praised Japan as a civilized power now call it an aggressor. The French, busy bleeding in Verdun, mutter that Japan is meddling. The British grow polite but distant, like hosts realizing their guest might not leave. And the Americans? They begin watching the Pacific with binoculars instead of smiles. Still, the Japanese government holds its line. In diet debates, Foreign Minister Kato insists that the demands were misinterpreted. He claims Japan only sought regional stability. The phrase becomes an official mantra, polite, sterile, and infinitely elastic. You hear it everywhere, in speeches, in editorials, in casual conversation. Stability. It sounds noble, but you know what it really means? Control. Meanwhile, China seethes. The boycott spreads from the ports to the interior. In Nanjing, workers strike. In Tianjin, students riot. Shopkeepers refuse to sell Japanese matches or bicycles. Tailors tear Japanese cloth into rags. The movement becomes a moral crusade, part protest, part penance. A newspaper editorial reads, "The Japanese seek our markets. We will give them silence instead." It's poetic, defiant, and contagious. And yet, not everyone in China joins the fury. Some merchants quietly smuggle Japanese goods under false labels. Profit, after all, doesn't wave flags. Others argue that resistance is pointless against an empire backed by warships. In dim back rooms, the debates turn bitter. Do we fight with pride or eat with shame? One man asks. The question has no answer. Not then, not ever. Back in Tokyo, artists and writers respond in their own way. Magazines publish cartoons of the world ganging up on Japan. Uncle Sam wagging a finger, John Bull looking scandalized. The narrative shifts. Japan isn't the bully now, it's the misunderstood visionary. We work to lift Asia, one editorial says. and they call us imperialists. But when Europe does the same, it's civilization. The logic is defensive, even wounded, yet it resonates. For a nation once humiliated by Western gunboats, moral reversal feels intoxicating. You find yourself in a cafe near Shinjuku one rainy night, listening to two young officers debate in low tones. One argues that Japan must tread carefully, that prestige is built on restraint. The other shakes his head. Restraint, he spits. The West never restrained itself when it took from us. Why should we? You can hear the steel in his voice, the early tremor of a generation that will one day steer the nation toward war. Outside, the rain beats steadily on the cobblestones. Neon signs flicker over rows of umbrellas. You think of how empires always begin with rhetoric about justice, how every conquest calls itself a mission to civilize, to protect, to enlighten. You realize Japan's leaders have learned from the best. They've mastered Europe's language of domination, complete with its moral disguise. But history, like irony, has perfect timing. By late 1916, the economic tide begins to turn. The war in Europe devours resources, and Japan becomes the supplier the Allies can't do without. Orders for steel, uniforms, ammunition, and ships pour in. Factories work day and night. The ports never sleep. What Japan loses in Chinese markets, it more than gains from the Allied war machine. You visit the shipyards at Yokosuka and see boys barely out of school hammering rivets into new freighters. Steam whistles scream and sparks dance like fireflies in the night. A foreman wipes his brow and says proudly, "We're building faster than they can sink them." He's right. Japan's exports triple in 2 years. The yen strengthens. Gold reserves soar. For the first time in modern history, Japan becomes a creditor nation instead of a debtor. In the midst of prosperity, though, something uneasy stirs. Inflation explodes. Rice prices double. Rural families struggle while urban investors feast. A worker's wife in Osaka tells you, "They say the empire is rich. I only know my rice bowl is empty." You sense the class divide widening like a crack in porcelain, invisible from afar, fatal up close. And yet, Tokyo's skyline gleams with new money. Automobiles rattle down Ginza Avenue. Department stores glow with electric lights. Western clothes, jazz music, even film theaters bloom like neon flowers. The capital looks modern, confident, global. But beneath the glitter, nationalism hums like a hidden current. The humiliation of the 21 demands still burns, and prosperity only feeds the hunger to prove something greater, not just wealth, but worth. You attend a public rally where a politician declares, "Japan stands as the leader of Asia, not its servant." The crowd erupts in applause. The phrase "leader of Asia" echoes through the night, swelling with both pride and danger. You can't help thinking of how easily leadership becomes dominion, and how every empire begins by calling itself a guardian. Historians still debate whether the 21 demands were Japan's greatest mistake or its most honest confession. They revealed a country that had outgrown isolation, but not yet learned humility. A nation desperate to be recognized, yet terrified of being dismissed. You can't help feeling sympathy, even as you wince at its arrogance. Because beneath the power plays and treaties lies something painfully human. The fear of being underestimated. As you walk along the Bund in Shanghai again, you watch the riverboats glide past, their lanterns flickering on the water. The boycott has faded, replaced by cautious trade. Japan and China glare at each other from opposite banks. Two civilizations too proud, too wounded, too entangled to ever truly part. The night air smells of coal smoke and jasmine. Somewhere, a gramophone scratches out a European waltz, its melody drifting above the noise of rickshaws and hawkers. The world, for all its rage, keeps moving. But you know that the embers of resentment never really cool. They simply wait, patient, quiet, glowing faintly beneath the ash, until the wind changes again. You wake to the hiss of steam and the rhythmic clang of metal. Not gunfire this time, but factory life. It's 1917, and Japan hums like a great machine, finally running at full power. The war in Europe has turned distant battlefields into lucrative markets, and the empire has become the workshop of the Allies. Every port, every mill, every foundry sings the same industrial song. You walk through Osaka's textile district, where smokestacks bloom like iron trees. Women in blue work coats feed spools of thread into looms that clatter faster than a heartbeat. The air is thick with lint and ambition. These workers are the quiet victors of the war, their hands weaving not just cloth but Japan's new global reputation. You overhear a foreman boast that exports to India, China, and the Dutch East Indies have tripled. Even the British buy from us now, he laughs. Imagine that. Our old teachers ordering from their student, but not everyone's laughing. The same boom that fills government coffers empties dinner tables in the countryside. Rice prices soar. The farmer's profit shrinks. In Hokkaido, laborers strike for better wages. In Kyoto, women march for cheaper food. The newspapers call it the prosperity paradox. The richer Japan becomes, the hungrier its people feel. You stand by a dockside warehouse where sacks of rice are loaded for export, and you can't help noticing the irony. The grain heading overseas while housewives queue for scraps. Still, the war years are a golden age for business. New companies sprout overnight. Mitsubishi builds ships. Kawasaki builds locomotives. Sumitomo digs deeper into the earth for copper and coal. Bankers in bowler hats stroll into clubs, quoting Western finance terms as though reciting poetry. Tokyo's skyline transforms. Cranes, scaffolds, steel skeletons. The city hums with the optimism of people convinced they're building the future. Historians still debate whether Japan's wartime boom was driven by vision or luck. Maybe both. With Europe too busy bleeding itself dry, Asia becomes Japan's market by default. The empire sells silk to Russia, rifles to Britain, and paper to anyone who can pay in gold. And for the first time, Japan doesn't borrow from the West, it lends. The shift is subtle but seismic. The debtor of 1905 has become the creditor of 1917. You can almost feel the nation's spine straighten with pride. Yet prosperity has its own kind of danger. You visit a Tokyo cafe filled with young intellectuals debating what this new wealth means. One student declares that industrial progress will liberate the nation from dependency. Another scoffs. Liberate? It only enslaves us to machines. They argue until midnight, their cigarettes tracing halos of smoke in the dim light. You realize they're wrestling with something bigger than economics, a question of identity. Japan has mastered Western technology, but not decided whether it wants Western values. In the newspapers, headlines celebrate record exports and new factories, but tucked in the back pages are quieter stories: labor riots, food shortages, and whispers of profiteering. You pass a factory owner's mansion lit by electric chandeliers, while a line of workers waits outside a rice shop 2 streets away. Progress, it seems, casts long shadows. Then comes 1918, and the shadows burst into flame. It begins in Toyama, a small coastal town, where women storm a rice merchant store shouting, "We can't eat your prices!" Their protest spreads like wildfire. First to Osaka, then Kobe, then Tokyo. Within weeks, the rice riots engulf the nation. More than 1 million people take to the streets. Shops burn. Police clash with crowds. The government sends troops, but even soldiers hesitate to beat their own starving mothers. You stand on a bridge overlooking Tokyo Bay as the smoke rises in the distance. The air smells of salt and rebellion. The boom years promised comfort. Instead, they've delivered unrest. The newspapers blame agitators, but you know better. Prosperity without fairness breeds fury. and Japan is learning that the hard way. Yet even amid the chaos, there's growth. In Yokohama, shipyards keep hammering. In Nagoya, munitions plants expand. The war in Europe still demands supplies, and Japan cannot afford to stop. You visit a factory that produces rifle cartridges for the British Army. The manager, a soft-spoken man with soot on his hands, tells you, "We build for them now, but one day we'll build for ourselves." His tone is calm, but his eyes burn with something fierce. The quiet conviction that Japan's destiny no longer depends on anyone else's war. By autumn, the riots fade, the war in Europe nears its end, and Japan emerges richer than ever. The numbers are staggering. Exports quadrupled since 1914. Industrial production doubled. Gold reserves overflowing. The government declares a new era of self-reliance. You walk past a billboard showing a Japanese family smiling beside the slogan, "Made in Japan," made with pride. It's part advertisement, part prophecy. And beneath it all, you feel something else rising. Ambition, disguised as gratitude. Japan has proven itself a reliable ally, a modern economy, a disciplined nation. But it's not content with applause anymore. The elites begin to talk about status. At the peace table, they say, Japan must sit not as a junior partner, but as an equal among the great powers. We've earned our seat, says one politician. The world will see that. But equality in the world of empires is a currency with a fixed exchange rate, and it rarely favors newcomers. You remember how the British once praised Japan as efficient but small in number. They meant it kindly, but the compliment still cuts. Efficiency without size is utility. Power without respect is servitude. Japan's leaders understand that perfectly. At night, you walk along the Sumida River, watching lanterns float downstream during the Bon Festival. Their reflections shimmer like fireflies, hundreds of tiny suns drifting on black water. You think of how far Japan has come since the Meiji Restoration and how restless it has become since tasting modernity. You wonder if a nation, like a person, can grow too quickly to understand its own reflection. Historians still argue whether the First World War transformed Japan or merely revealed what was already there. Ambition, insecurity, brilliance, and hunger wrapped in discipline. What's clear is that the war has given Japan proof of concept. It can operate globally, profit from chaos, and stand among giants. The question is no longer can it rise, but how high will it try to climb, and at what cost? You gaze across the industrial skyline, cranes silhouetted against the moon, chimneys breathing steam into the night, and you realize something profound. The sound you hear isn't just the hum of progress, it's the ticking of a clock. Because no empire, no machine, no nation can run forever without heat building inside its gears. For now, Japan hums contentedly, proud and prosperous. But if you listen closely, beneath the engines and the applause, you can almost hear it, a faint rhythmic whisper coming from the future. Boom, boom, boom. The year is 1917 again, but the horizon isn't the Pacific this time. It's the Mediterranean. You stand on the deck of a Japanese destroyer, slicing through a restless gray sea, half a world away from home. Salt spray stings your face, and somewhere over the wind, you hear a Morse signal crackle through static. SOS. Another Allied transport has gone down, torpedoed by a German U-boat. The war in Europe has reached every ocean now, and Japan, this so-called small-in-number ally, is about to prove just how far its navy can reach. When Britain called for help, Japan didn't hesitate. The Royal Navy was stretched thin. Convoys were dying faster than they could be replaced. So, from 1917 onward, Japanese destroyers and cruisers steamed west, across the Indian Ocean, through the Suez Canal, and into the heart of Europe's war. It was the Empire's first truly global deployment. Sailors from Yokosuka now patrolled the coasts of France, Malta, and Italy. You can almost hear the disbelief in Allied ports. Japanese flags fluttering over Mediterranean harbors once ruled exclusively by Western fleets. Your ship, Sakaki, is one of them. She's small, fast, and deadly. 2 funnels, 3 guns, and a crew that barely sleeps. Every man on board knows that the U-boats are everywhere. The ocean feels haunted. No enemies in sight, yet the fear of sudden death lurking under every wave. Even the gulls fly nervously. The Sakaki's orders are simple: escort the convoys, rescue the survivors, and hunt the hunters. It sounds noble. In practice, it's endless monotony punctuated by moments of terror. You lean over the bridge one gray morning, scanning the horizon. Nothing but fog and the steady thrum of the engines. Then, without warning, boom! The ship lurches as a torpedo explodes nearby. Men shout, alarms wail, and you taste the metallic tang of panic. But the torpedo misses. The sea closes over its failed bite, and the Sakaki lives to fight another day. Others aren't as lucky. You hear about the British liner SS Transylvania, torpedoed off Cape Vado. She carried over 3,000 souls, soldiers packed shoulder to shoulder. When the ship went down, Japanese destroyers Matsu and Sakaki rushed in under threat of a second strike. Amid the chaos, Japanese sailors threw down rope ladders, hauled men from the freezing water, and saved nearly everyone. The British commander later wrote, "The Italians are inefficient, the French unreliable, the Greeks out of the calculation, and the Japanese excellent but few." That line becomes legend back in Tokyo. Newspapers print it like gospel, proof that Japan's navy is no longer regional, it's indispensable. You can picture the cartoon, Britannia shaking hands with the rising sun, while U-boats slink away like cowards. At sea, though, glory feels heavy. The Sakaki herself will later be hit by a torpedo near Crete. 44 sailors die instantly. The survivors patch the hull with planks, curse the invisible enemy, and sail home, limping but unbroken. You stand at the rail during the burial at sea, the bodies wrapped in white cloth sliding into the waves. The chaplain's voice trembles, the sky burns red with sunset, and you realize that for Japan, this is not just alliance, it's baptism. The empire has entered the world's bloodstream of sacrifice. Historians still argue whether Japan's Mediterranean mission was purely altruistic or quietly strategic. Perhaps it was both. The Navy gained priceless experience, long-distance logistics, international coordination, anti-submarine warfare. It learned how to fuel and repair ships thousands of miles from home, how to navigate the diplomatic etiquette of Western admirals, how to earn respect, not through treaties, but through competence. You see that respect in small things. In Malta's Grand Harbor, British sailors tip their caps when the Japanese flag is raised. Local children shout "Nippon" as they run alongside the docks. The Japanese sailors smile shyly, handing out rice crackers and postcards of Mount Fuji. Some of them have never been that far from home, yet they find themselves symbols of an empire stretching across hemispheres. Back in Japan, their heroism becomes a national story. Recruitment posters show destroyers plowing through stormy seas, the caption reading, "Protect the world's peace, sail with honor." It's clever messaging. The same nation that only a few years earlier was accused of bullying China is now portrayed as the guardian of civilization. You can't decide whether that's irony or evolution, or both. Still, there's pride. The Mediterranean campaign gives Japan something that money can't buy: legitimacy. In the councils of the Allies, Japanese officers now sit beside British and French counterparts, their uniforms as crisp, their medals as heavy. A small navy, one admiral admits, but a world-class one. You wander the quays of Malta at dusk, watching the ships rock gently in the tide. The harbor smells of salt, oil, and faint perfume from the nearby cafes where Allied officers drink away their nerves. A Japanese ensign hums softly beside you, an old folk tune from Kyushu, reworked into a marching song. The melody drifts across the water, merging with the distant bells of Valletta's churches. East and west, superstition and steel, all tangled in the same weary harmony. One evening, as orders come through for another escort mission, you overhear two British sailors talking. They don't say much, those Japanese, one mutters. His friend nods. Aye, but when the shooting starts, they don't blink. You can't help smiling. Respect from the British. That's rarer than fair weather in this sea. By mid-1918, the U-boat menace begins to fade. Convoys grow safer. Losses drop. The Japanese ships keep sailing, their presence now routine. But for the men aboard, every dawn still feels fragile. They've seen too many fires on the horizon, too many black plumes where ships used to be. When the armistice finally comes, the celebration feels muted. The Mediterranean is calm again, but it's littered with ghosts. You stand on the deck as the Sakaki steams home, the crew sunburned, exhausted, but unbroken. As Japan's coastline appears through morning mist, a cheer rises, part relief, part disbelief. They've traveled halfway around the world, fought an invisible enemy, and returned to tell the tale. In Tokyo, the Navy's return sparks a wave of pride. Parades fill the streets, children wave flags, veterans receive medals stamped with the imperial chrysanthemum. You spot a sailor from your ship holding his infant son, whispering, "Remember this, little one. Your father helped save the world." The boy gurgles, unaware he's holding the thread of a story that will one day unravel in another, far bloodier ocean. For now, though, Japan basks in quiet triumph. The nation has shown it can act beyond its region, cooperate with Western powers, and contribute more than promises. It's not just an ally of convenience anymore. It's a global participant. Yet as you watch the celebrations, you can't shake the feeling that something deeper has changed. Japan has tasted global reach, and like all first tastes of power, it leaves both pride and hunger behind. Historians still debate the Mediterranean deployment's true legacy. Some call it a noble contribution, others the seed of imperial overconfidence. But you know what it really was? Proof of capacity. Proof that Japan could send its flag to the farthest seas and be taken seriously. That proof will echo long after the war ends, through treaties, through ambitions, through oceans yet to be named by blood. The sun sets over the harbor, golden light spilling over rows of ships. You lean on the railing, feeling the vibration of the engines beneath your feet, and whisper to yourself, half in wonder, half in warning, "We've crossed the world once, we'll do it again." The war is over, but Japan's ships keep moving. The year is 1919, and the Navy has returned home not just with medals, but with maps, dozens of them, folded and red-marked, tracing supply routes across 3 oceans. You sit in a dim naval office in Yokosuka, the room filled with tobacco smoke and the rustle of paper. Admirals pore over charts of the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, the Mediterranean. For the first time, the Japanese Navy knows what global power feels like. The old guard calls it a miracle of logistics. You call it practice. Every convoy, every refueling stop, every emergency repair taught lessons the Empire will never forget. A sailor's diary you flip through reads simply, "We learned how to keep the ocean alive under our feet." The line lingers with you. It's poetry wrapped in steel. Now that the fighting has stopped, the real battle begins. How to keep what's been gained. Across the empire, Japan's naval strategists argue that expansion must follow knowledge. The British Empire is built on coal and cables, says one admiral. Ours must be built on oil and distance. He traces a circle on the map from Tokyo to Singapore to Rabaul to Truk to Saipan. a necklace of bases glinting like teeth across the Pacific. Historians still debate whether Japan's leadership at this moment understood the gravity of what they were dreaming. Some see foresight, others arrogance. You see inevitability. A country that masters logistics never forgets the routes it once traveled. At sea, those lessons are already reshaping the fleet. Submarines, destroyers, supply ships, each redesigned with range in mind. Steam gives way to oil, wooden charts to radio waves. The naval academies buzz with new doctrines borrowed from Britain, but twisted to suit Japanese precision. You walk past a classroom where a chalkboard diagram shows concentric circles labeled Outer Defense Perimeter. The instructor taps it with his pointer and says, "A nation of islands must think in circles." The students nod, notebooks open, eyes shining. None of them know it yet, but that diagram will one day become prophecy. You visit Kure Naval Yard, where the dry docks ring with hammer blows. New cruisers rise from skeleton frames, sleek and modern. The shipwrights talk of endurance, of how ships must cross oceans without help. "We'll never be caught short of fuel again," one engineer mutters. His words sound practical, but you sense the undertone of obsession. The Mediterranean taught Japan that power depends not on numbers, but on reach. Meanwhile, the Pacific islands Japan seized during the war are being transformed. What were once coconut plantations now sprout airstrips and wireless stations. The Navy builds observation posts, storage depots, even meteorological stations. Officially, they're part of Japan's new League of Nations mandates, the civilized term for colonies you get to keep if you behave. The paperwork calls them trust territories. The sailors call them stepping stones. You walk the coral shore of Truk Lagoon, watching workers unload crates stamped with Japanese characters. The water is as clear as glass, the reef alive with color. But everywhere you look are signs of permanence. Wooden piers, flagpoles, the low hum of a generator. Empire, you realize, doesn't always arrive with a bang. Sometimes it creeps in with the whine of an engine. Local islanders watch the newcomers cautiously. Some trade coconuts for canned goods. Others retreat into the jungle. One elder, his face tattooed with ancient markings, tells a Japanese officer through an interpreter, "You build houses of metal. They will rust faster than our trees." The officer laughs politely, not understanding that the man is giving him a prophecy. Back in Tokyo, the Navy's prestige has never been higher. Officers stroll through Ginza like movie stars. The newspapers publish serialized accounts of the Mediterranean adventures, the rescues, the battles, the heroism. Children collect cigarette cards of warships the way others collect baseball players. And in cafes, students debate whether Japan's Navy has become the equal of Britain's. The question is flattering, but dangerous. The politicians know it too. Prime Minister Hara tries to temper the euphoria. "Our fleet must serve peace," he says. But peace, you notice, has become a kind of staging ground, an intermission between rehearsals for greater things. You attend a naval review in Yokohama Bay. The emperor watches from a raised pavilion as destroyers glide past in perfect formation. Their hulls gleam under the sun like sword blades. The crowd cheers, and you feel it. That unmistakable pride, half noble, half intoxicating. The orchestra plays Kimigayo, its slow, solemn rhythm echoing across the water. You wonder if anyone else feels how martial the melody has become. After the review, you linger near a group of young officers sharing sake. One of them, his cap tilted back, says quietly, "The war proved we can serve the world. Now we must lead it." His friend laughs and replies, "Lead? The world isn't ready for that." The first man smirks. "Then we'll make it ready." The others fall silent. You file the moment away like a storm cloud on a clear day. Historians still argue whether these post-war years mark the birth of Japanese overconfidence or simply the continuation of its discipline. Either way, a shift is unmistakable. The country's self-image is changing, from student to competitor, from helper to claimant. The phrase great power begins appearing in editorials, always capitalized, as if shouting from the page. The League of Nations confirms Japan's control over the South Seas mandates. It's a diplomatic triumph, framed as a reward for faithful service. But as you study the map, you notice how those rewards stretch across the very arteries of the Pacific. They're not gifts, they're footholds. The Foreign Ministry calls it a zone of responsibility. The Navy calls it our outer perimeter. You call it what it is: empire by stealth. On the docks of Saipan, a Japanese sailor carves his initials into a palm tree. K. Tanaka, 1919. He has no idea that decades later, the tree will still stand amid wreckage, his initials blackened by fire. For now, it's just a souvenir of service, a mark of pride. As you sail back toward Japan, the sunset glows over the Pacific like a molten coin. The deck smells of oil and salt. The horizon feels infinite. You close your eyes and think about what the Navy has become. Not just ships and men, but a symbol of national destiny. Japan's admirals have tasted global seas and returned convinced they belong to them. The Mediterranean was a test. The mandates are the reward. The Pacific, the temptation. You realize that the line between alliance and ambition is as thin as the horizon itself, a shimmering mirage that shifts depending on where you stand. The engines hum beneath your feet, steady and sure. You imagine the maps folded in naval drawers, the circles expanding outward, the lessons of logistics turned into doctrine. You can almost hear the future whisper across the waves. The world is wide, but not beyond reach. The guns fall silent in Europe, and suddenly, the world begins to talk again. It's 1919, and you find yourself in the grand marble corridors of the Palace of Versailles, a building meant for kings now crawling with diplomats. The air smells of perfume, ink, and ambition. Delegates from every corner of the world wander the halls clutching papers, promises, and grudges. You can hear the orchestra tuning in the distant ballroom, playing not for dancers, but for history. You trail behind Japan's delegation as they enter the gilded Hall of Mirrors. On the polished floor, reflections of chandeliers shimmer like ripples on water. Baron Makino Nobuaki leads the Japanese team, dignified, reserved, carrying himself like a man painfully aware that every gesture will be judged. At his side is a younger diplomat, Ishii Kikujiro, whose calm eyes mask a nervous fire. Japan has arrived as one of the victors, sitting at the same table as Britain, France, and the United States. For a country that only half a century ago lived under feudal lords, the symbolism is intoxicating. But as you watch, it becomes clear that victory does not mean equality. The Western powers dominate every conversation. The big three, Wilson, Lloyd George, and Clemenceau, speak of justice and peace while quietly dividing the spoils of empire. Japan listens politely, offering nods where others offer ultimatums. You notice how the interpreters translate Japanese proposals slowly, as though weighing every word for Western approval. Historians still debate what Japan really wanted from Versailles. Some say territory, others say respect. Both are true. Japan sought official recognition of what it had already seized, Germany's colonies in Shandong in the Pacific. And it wanted something grander, something intangible, acknowledgement as a modern power among equals. You can almost feel the tension when the Shandong issue comes up. China's delegation, led by Wellington Koo, argues passionately that German holdings should be returned to Chinese sovereignty. After all, China had joined the Allies too, but Japan's diplomats insist the opposite, that their troops had fought and bled at Tsingtao, and that they had taken the German leasehold fair and square. The British and French, eager to keep Japan cooperative in the new League of Nations, side quietly with Tokyo. The decision is made. Shandong goes to Japan, It's a small line in the treaty, but an enormous scar in Chinese memory. You can almost hear the echo that will become the May 4th movement. Students flooding the streets of Beijing, shouting that their country's dignity has been sold. You close your eyes and wonder whether the ink drying here in Versailles smells faintly of gunpowder. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, Japan's claims go unchallenged. The former German islands, the Marshalls, Marianas, Carolines, are granted as mandates under the League of Nations. The language is paternal, almost benevolent. Japan will administer these territories for the good of their inhabitants. Everyone in the room knows it's just empire with better branding. Still, Japan's delegates are pleased. The maps are updated, the islands shaded red. Newspapers in Tokyo print headlines like, "Empire Expanded, the rising sun over the South Seas." On paper, it looks like triumph, but you notice the subtle shift in tone among Western reporters. The word ally begins to fade. The word ambitious takes its place. And then comes the moment that will haunt the century, the proposal for a racial equality clause. It's simple, almost naive. Japan asks that the new League of Nations recognize the equality of all nations and peoples. No special privileges, just respect. You stand among the press benches as Baron Makino delivers the speech, his voice even, his logic unassailable. "We are gathered," he says, "to create a just world. Let justice begin with recognition of human dignity." For a heartbeat, you feel the room lean forward. Some delegates applaud softly. China, Italy, Greece, even Brazil nods approval. Then you see Woodrow Wilson's expression harden. The Australian Prime Minister, Billy Hughes, whispers furiously to him, "If this passes, our White Australia policy collapses." Wilson frowns, clears his throat, and declares that the proposal, despite majority support, lacks unanimous consent. The clause dies quietly, strangled by procedure. You can hear the breath leave the Japanese delegation like air from a punctured drum. Makino bows, expression unreadable, but the silence that follows is louder than any protest. You realize something irreversible has just happened. Japan came seeking equality. It leaves with confirmation that the West will never grant it. Back in Tokyo, the reaction is bitter. The press calls the rejection a slap in the face of civilization. Students burn effigies of Wilson in the streets. One editorial reads, "They invited us to dine, but kept the knives dull and the chairs low." The phrase becomes infamous, whispered in bars and military academies alike. Yet at Versailles itself, the show goes on. The peace treaty is signed under frescoed ceilings, pens scratching like insects on parchment. The war that destroyed empires has given birth to new ones. Outside, rain patters against the palace windows as if the heavens themselves are unimpressed. Later that night, you walk the gardens alone. Statues of gods and kings watch silently as the fountains murmur. You think of Japan's long journey, from the Meiji reforms to this gilded hall, and of how victory, when mixed with humiliation, breeds something volatile. Historians still argue about whether Japan's disappointment at Versailles planted the seeds of future militarism. Some say yes, that this was the moment the nation turned inward, deciding respect must be seized, not granted. Others see it as a wound that healed over pride but festered beneath policy. Either way, you feel the shift. The empire that entered the Great War as a loyal ally is leaving it as a disillusioned one. As you prepare to leave the palace, you pass a wall-sized mirror reflecting the delegates still talking in clusters. Their reflections stretch endlessly. Men in suits, medals, uniforms, all staring at themselves. You catch your own reflection there, standing between East and West, and wonder if anyone else sees what you see. Not peace, but prelude. Outside, a French guard lights your cigarette and says, "It's over, monsieur." You nod, exhaling smoke into the cold air. "No," you murmur softly. "It's only beginning." The train hums through the night, carrying you away from Versailles and back toward Tokyo. But the echo of rejection refuses to fade. The ink on the peace treaty is barely dry, yet Japan already senses that the world it fought to defend still sees it as foreign. Useful, perhaps, but never equal. The racial equality clause had failed not for lack of reason, but for lack of courage. You can almost still hear Wilson's dry voice declaring that unanimous consent was absent, while the Australian delegate smirked into his notes. The newspapers at home turn the story into a national wound. One headline reads, "Japan's honor denied by the West." Another calls it the second humiliation, a phrase meant to rhyme with the unequal treaties of the 19th century. In classrooms, teachers tell their students that the Western powers preach fairness while practicing fear. You sit in one of those classrooms weeks later, listening as a lecturer taps the chalkboard. "They let us fight beside them," he says, "but not sit beside them." The students nod, silent, the chalk squeaking like a suppressed emotion. Still, Japan's delegation does not return empty-handed. The Shandong Peninsula, the Pacific Mandates, and a coveted seat among the great powers all come home in their luggage. To the politicians, that's progress. To the public, it's a trade, dignity for territory. The argument tears through Tokyo like a storm. At Ginza cafes, liberals toast to the new League of Nations. They call it a civilized step and insist Japan must remain patient, that equality will come through diplomacy. In smoky taverns down the street, nationalists slam their cups and curse that patience is the privilege of fools. "They will never see us as equals," one man growls. So why pretend to be one of them? Historians still debate whether that sentiment was born out of humiliation or inevitability. Maybe both. You wander the waterfront at Yokohama and think about how resentment, once mixed with pride, turns into something volatile, like oil slicked on seawater, glimmering beautifully before it burns. Inside the foreign ministry, the debate takes a quieter form. Bureaucrats argue over whether to focus outward or inward. "We must join the Western order," insists one, "and shape it from within." Another replies, "No, we must build our own." Neither wins, but their quarrel will echo through the coming decades, in treaties, in speeches, in blood. Meanwhile, at naval headquarters, officers study the maps inherited from Versailles. Japan's new territories, Saipan, Truk, Palau, stretch like stepping stones across the ocean. Mandates, the League calls them, but to the admirals, they're unsinkable carriers. They begin sketching out long-term plans for airfields, ports, and fuel depots. "Peace," one commander remarks dryly, "is simply time to prepare." You recognize the tone. Respectability on the outside, suspicion underneath. The civilian leaders sense it too. Prime Minister Hara Takashi tries to temper the mood, reminding Parliament that Japan's place among the great powers depends on restraint. "We must not alarm the world with ambition," he says. The Diet applauds politely, then quietly ignores him. Even in peace, Japan is restless. You walk through the Imperial Palace gardens that summer. The plum blossoms have fallen, replaced by cicadas shrieking in the heat. A young officer leans on the bridge beside you, reading a newspaper. "They mock our proposal," he says bitterly. "They say we demanded too much." You ask him what he thinks. He folds the paper carefully and answers, "No. We demanded too little." Across the city, artists begin to capture the mood. Painters depict rising suns half-shaded by clouds. Poets write about the friend who fears your handshake. Even fashion mirrors politics. Western suits give way again to military uniforms at public events, crisp and severe. Pride reclaims the space where optimism used to live. Yet, not all is anger. In universities, new thinkers preach the idea of Pan-Asianism, the notion that Japan, rejected by the West, should unite Asia instead. "We will lead the East," they say, "as they lead the West." It sounds noble, even compassionate, but you can already hear the edge sharpening beneath the words. Leadership, after all, often begins as liberation and ends as dominion. In the months that follow, Japan sends advisors to China, engineers to Manchuria, and surveyors to the Pacific Mandates. They go under the banner of development, but you notice that most of their reports are stamped confidential. One observer writes, "Our role is to bring light to Asia." Another adds quietly in the margin, "and to keep the torch." At night, you visit a tea house overlooking Tokyo Bay. The owner, a gray-haired woman who lost 2 sons in the war, says softly, "They tell us the world is at peace, but I still hear the ships." Outside, the harbor flickers with lights. Cargo ships, patrol boats, fishing vessels, all part of the same restless rhythm. You realize she's right. The war is over, but Japan hasn't stopped moving. It's just changed direction. Then, almost unexpectedly, comes a gesture of vindication. In 1920, Japan becomes a founding member of the League of Nations, the only Asian power invited to the club. The press celebrates it as poetic justice, the final proof of equality. At the League's first assembly in Geneva, Japan's flag flutters proudly among the Western banners. The newspapers call it a new dawn. You smile, knowing dawns often look most beautiful before storms. Historians still argue about whether the League membership soothed Japan's wounded pride or merely concealed it. It did both. The diplomats learned the art of polite masks, smiling through clenched teeth at conferences, shaking hands with men who had voted against their dignity. In public, Japan spoke the language of cooperation. In private, it began preparing the grammar of independence. You picture those League meetings, the rows of flags, the speeches about peace, the whispered deals during recess. Somewhere in the back row sits a Japanese delegate, calm and inscrutable, taking notes while others speak of democracy and freedom. Perhaps he's thinking of the racial clause that never was. Perhaps he's memorizing every insult, every dismissal, every hesitant compliment. By the end of 1920, the glow of victory has faded, leaving only its aftertaste. Japan has land, prestige, and wealth, but not the one thing it wanted most: respect freely given. That absence hangs in the air like the smell of smoke long after a fire. You return to the Tokyo docks at dusk. The tide laps against the hulls of merchant ships, the masts creaking softly. The city skyline glows orange against the setting sun. A gull circles overhead, crying once before vanishing into the gray. You watch it go and realize what Japan has become: a nation no longer searching for approval, but for direction. And direction, once found, rarely stops moving. The sea whispers beneath you, steady and endless, as though murmuring a warning only you can hear. All journeys that begin in pride end in pursuit. The wind coming off the Sea of Japan bites colder now. It's 1919 turning to 1920, and peace in Europe hasn't brought calm to Asia. Russia is on fire, its empire torn apart by revolution. The red tide of Bolshevism creeps eastward through Siberia, and the Western powers, terrified, scramble to contain it. Japan sees a new kind of opportunity in the chaos. The telegrams from Washington and London read like polite invitations. "We would appreciate your assistance in stabilizing the region." Stabilizing, of course, means intervening. You stand on a frozen dock in Vladivostok, boots crunching on frost. The port, once bustling with czarist commerce, now echoes with the sound of boots. American, British, Canadian, French, and Japanese. Thousands of them. Among all these uniforms, the Japanese are the most numerous, their discipline as sharp as the cold. They've come under the banner of the Siberian Intervention, a mission to protect Allied supplies and, unofficially, to shape Russia's future. When the ships first arrived, the locals cheered. Better foreign order, they thought, than domestic anarchy. But as months turn into years, the welcome cools. You march through streets lined with shuttered shops and half-buried wagons. The snow hides the ruins, but not the weariness.
A Japanese officer beside you mutters, "We came to save them, but from whom?"
The intervention becomes an exercise in confusion. No one seems sure who the enemy is. The Red Army? The White Counter-Revolutionaries? Bandits? Hunger? Historians still argue whether Japan intended to fight communism or simply seized the chance to expand its influence in Siberia. The truth, as always, lies somewhere between strategy and improvisation. You travel with a column of Japanese soldiers moving inland toward Khabarovsk. The frost crunches under every step. Rifles glint dull in the gray light. The men are polite to civilians, at least at first. They hand out rice, repair bridges, and keep order. But each day, more wagons arrive carrying supplies, not for charity, but for permanent presence. A soldier jokes, "We build snowmen now. Maybe next year we build railways." Everyone laughs, but not loudly. In their camps, officers hang maps of Siberia beside ones of Manchuria and Korea. The lines blur together in the candlelight. "This is our northern frontier now," says one colonel, tapping the map. You realize he's thinking of empire again, of lines extending outward like cracks in the ice. The winter drags on endlessly. Temperatures drop below 30 degrees below zero. You wake to find the world covered in white silence. Horses freeze standing. Breath crystallizes midair. The Japanese troops endure better than most, meticulous, organized, almost mechanical. But even discipline can't warm you forever. You hear them mutter in the dark about home, about mothers, wives, miso soup, the scent of the sea. One man carves a miniature torii gate from birchwood and sets it at the edge of camp. It stands there like a lonely prayer in the wilderness. Meanwhile, back in Tokyo, the government struggles to justify the intervention's growing cost. Thousands of troops, millions of yen, and no clear objective. The newspapers begin to question whether Japan is chasing ghosts. But among the military elite, the campaign feels like a test of will. "Russia is a sick bear," one general writes. "If we don't act, it may rise against us." The paranoia feels familiar, the logic of all empires pretending to act out of fear. As the months pass, the war in Siberia unravels further. The White Army collapses, the Reds surge, and the foreign allies begin to pack up. The Americans leave first, their ships vanishing over the icy horizon. The British and French follow. Only the Japanese stay, their bases fortified, their officers claiming they must protect the region until stability returns. Everyone knows what that really means. You watch a meeting between a Japanese officer and a local warlord in a candlelit railway office. Outside, the snow falls in silent sheets. The officer slides a briefcase across the table. Inside, cash and maps. "We only wish for order," he says. The warlord grins, teeth yellow against the lamplight. "And I only wish for allies." The handshake that follows feels colder than the weather. In the villages, resentment grows. There are skirmishes, ambushes at night, shots fired from forests. For every red partisan killed, 2 more appear. Civilians vanish and whispers spread. The occupiers are no better than the Tsar's men. You see a Japanese patrol stop a peasant cart one morning searching for weapons. They find nothing, only firewood. Yet the fear in the peasant's eyes says enough. You realize that stability is just another word for control. When news finally reaches Tokyo in 1922 that all remaining allies have withdrawn, the cabinet debates for days. The Americans are pressuring hard, warning Japan that staying longer will poison its reputation. The army argues for persistence. The civilians plead for retreat. The emperor's advisors choose diplomacy. After nearly 3 years, Japan finally agrees to withdraw its troops. The return journey is quiet, almost embarrassed. You watch soldiers board transports at Vladivostok, their faces blank with exhaustion. Some have frostbite scars. Others carry mementos, a carved pipe, a fur cap, a Russian novel half frozen in a rucksack. None seem sure what they accomplished. Historians still argue what Japan gained from the Siberian intervention. Officially, nothing. No land, no treaties, no glory. But unofficially, it gained experience, logistics in frozen terrain, the psychology of occupation, the taste of acting alone. You sense the lessons sinking in. Alliances are temporary, but ambition is permanent. Back in Japan, the returning troops march through silent streets. The crowds wave, but the cheers sound hollow. The public mood has shifted. Inflation is biting again. Rice prices rising. Labor strikes spreading. The war's profits are spent, the boom fading into bitterness. The soldiers' eyes are distant, still filled with Siberia's endless snow. One evening, you sit in a bar near Shimbashi Station. Two veterans at the next table are laughing, swapping stories. One says, "We built fires with rubles. It was cheaper than wood." The other replies, "At least the Russians didn't shoot as straight as their winters." They laugh again, but the laughter sounds brittle, like glass under pressure. When you step outside, Tokyo's lights blur in the mist. The city feels older, wearier. You realize the Siberian adventure has changed Japan in ways no one yet understands. It has proven that the country can act without permission, hold ground beyond its borders, and then walk away when convenient. It's a strange kind of confidence, half pride, half cynicism. You stand by the harbor, watching the last transport ship fade into the dark. Snowflakes melt on your gloves, leaving tiny wet circles like stamps of memory. The sea is calm again, the city quiet. But beneath that calm, something restless stirs. A conviction that Japan's destiny doesn't stop at its coasts. The Siberian wind has followed you home, whispering of vast lands, empty and waiting. You step off the train in Yokohama and the city feels different. Still bright, still bustling, but underneath, a new unease hums. The war has ended. The Siberian soldiers have come home, yet the peace everyone expected has refused to arrive. Factories that once thundered with wartime contracts now stand half idle. Workers protest for wages that can't keep up with inflation. Farmers march on rice merchants again, demanding food at prices they can afford. You feel it in the air. Japan is prosperous but restless, proud yet unsure what that pride should build next. The newspapers speak of reconstruction in Europe, but Japan is already reconstructing itself, spiritually, economically, politically. On one page, an editorial praises democracy. On another, a pamphlet warns that decadent Western ideals will rot the nation's soul. In cafes, students debate Marx. In barracks, sergeants whisper about destiny. "We helped the West win their war," says one ex-soldier bitterly. But what did it win us? Debt and lectures. You sip your tea and realize that the conversation is no longer about cooperation. It's about comparison. At the Navy yards, the hammering never truly stops. The Mediterranean lessons have hardened into doctrine. Destroyers and cruisers are designed with greater range. Aircraft carriers are drawn on blueprints with the same reverence once reserved for temples. Admirals argue for parity with Britain and America. If they respect only power, one says, then let them measure ours in tons and barrels. Another, older officer shakes his head. Respect cannot be forced, he warns. The younger men glance away. They've stopped believing that. Meanwhile, politicians in Tokyo juggle a new, precarious balance. Prime Minister Hara, a civilian and reformer, preaches moderation, autonomy, and gradual democracy. He expands suffrage, supports education, and reins in the military's budget. For a moment, it feels as though Japan might finally settle into something normal, prosperous, parliamentary, peaceful. But history has never liked moderation. In 1921, as Hara travels to Kyoto, a nationalist assassin stabs him to death at the station. You imagine the train still hissing steam as his body is carried away. the air thick with the sound of one dream exhaling its last breath. The killing shocks the country, but not everyone mourns. In the right-wing newspapers, editorials whisper that too much democracy weakens the spirit. In military academies, cadets murmur that the politicians have grown soft. And in the Navy clubs, officers raise quiet toasts to discipline restored. You can sense the pendulum beginning to swing back towards steel. Across the Pacific, new treaties form like paper fences meant to contain ambition. The Washington Naval Conference of 1921 to 1922 declares limits. For every 5 British or American battleships, Japan may have 3. The diplomats sign politely, calling it cooperation. The admirals sign grimly, calling it humiliation. You attend the signing ceremony in your imagination. Crystal chandeliers, silver pens, forced smiles. One Japanese delegate mutters under his breath. They call it peace, but it smells like leash. Historians still argue whether the treaty saved Japan from bankruptcy or stabbed its pride. Both are true. It prevents ruin but deepens resentment. The Navy obeys the ratios on paper, then begins building secretly in theory. More submarines, faster cruisers, new naval air wings. Treaties, one officer tells you, are useful because they tell us exactly what to exceed. Back home, society splits into 2 worlds. In the cities, the middle class grows. Movie theaters bloom. Jazz drifts from cafes, and women cut their hair short, scandalizing their elders. The magazines call them moga, modern girls, and celebrate them as proof that Japan is worldly now. But in the countryside, the mood darkens. Farmers drown in debt, crops fail, and sons who can't inherit land drift toward the army, where food and purpose are guaranteed. The distance between modern Tokyo and rural Akita feels wider than the Pacific itself. You spend an evening in a working-class district where gas lamps flicker above wooden stalls. A fisherman tells you, "They say we are rich, but only the city shines. Out here, we eat the bones, not the meat." His tone is calm, not bitter. Resignation spoken as fact. You realize how easy it is for discontent to wear the mask of discipline. At the same time, Japan's thinkers and artists wrestle with identity. The poet Yosano Akiko writes of peace and humanity. The philosopher Nishida Kitaro pens essays about the harmony of East and West. They dream of synthesis, not supremacy, but their voices are softer than the drums beginning to echo from parade grounds. National pride has found new rhythms. Marching songs, not love poems. In 1923, the earth itself joins the turmoil. On a bright September morning, the great Kanto earthquake rips through Tokyo and Yokohama. Buildings collapse, fires spread, the sea surges. In a single day, over 100,000 lives vanish into smoke. You walk through the ruins weeks later, the city still reeking of ash and grief. Amid the wreckage, rumors breed. Korean immigrants are looting, anarchists are plotting, foreigners are to blame. Mobs form, driven by fear. Soldiers patrol the streets not just with rifles, but with suspicion. The government restores order, but something darker remains. A proof of how thin civilization can be when cracked open. When reconstruction begins, it is both heroic and feverish. Skyscrapers rise, train lines double. The neon glow returns even brighter than before. Yet the memory of helplessness lingers. The ground itself betrayed us, one survivor tells you. We must never be weak again. It becomes a mantra that outlasts the rubble. By the late 1920s, Japan looks reborn, modern, urban, dynamic. Its factories churn again. Its films win prizes. Its ships dominate Pacific trade routes. To the casual observer, it seems the empire has found balance at last. But you know better. You've heard the speeches growing sharper, the press growing bolder, the word destiny whispered again in military circles. Peace has made the nation powerful, but not gentle. Historians will later call this the interwar drift, the slow, almost imperceptible slide from ambition to arrogance. Yet standing here on a Tokyo rooftop at sunset, the air hazy with smoke and possibility, you can understand why no one noticed. The skyline gleams, the flags wave, and the people believe they've mastered the world's rules. They don't see yet that they've merely learned how to rewrite them. You watch the harbor lights flicker on, one by one, like constellations reborn on water. Somewhere below, a gramophone plays a jazz tune imported from New York. Children laugh, soldiers march, street vendors shout. The nation hums with life, caught between modernity and memory. You exhale slowly and whisper to the wind, "You've come so far, but the road ahead doesn't forgive pride." You wake to the clang of ship bells echoing through Yokosuka Harbor. The sun rises over a forest of masts, the water glinting gold like polished metal. It's 1930 now, though the air still carries the unease of a country learning how to live with its own shadow. Japan stands taller than ever. Its factories hum, its fleets stretch far across the Pacific, but there's something brittle beneath the triumph, a tension that hums like a wire pulled too tight. The politicians call this a new era of balance. Newspapers praise democracy, but you can sense the word trembling under the ink. The Great Depression has rippled across the oceans, shattering markets everywhere. Exports plummet, unemployment soars, and the old scars of inequality split open again. In Tokyo, businessmen mutter about falling profits. In the countryside, peasants burn tax records in protest. The empire that once seemed unstoppable suddenly feels vulnerable. You wander through a naval base as the officers read news of America's tariffs and Britain's trade blocs. "They close the markets," one captain mutters, "and call us aggressive when we seek our own." Another officer slams his fist against a railing. "We carried their war on our backs," he says, "and now they fear our success." You can almost see the logic hardening in their eyes. The same pride that once built the fleet, now turning inward, souring into resentment. Historians will later call these years the hinge, the moment when Japan's global dreams began to twist into something darker. But to the men living it, it feels like vindication. They believe they've earned their place at the top table, only to be told there's no room. The memory of Versailles still lingers like a bad taste, and every treaty signed since feels like another reminder of limits. You stroll along the docks and watch the young sailors practice drills. They move with mechanical precision, faces calm, eyes bright. They've grown up in a Japan that has never known defeat, only progress. To them, ambition is not arrogance, it's inheritance. One sailor wipes sweat from his brow and smiles. "We're the generation that will finish what our fathers started," he says proudly. You nod, though you're not sure he knows what finish really means. In the shipyards, engineers test seaplanes and torpedo craft, experiments that look harmless enough on paper. Admirals talk of defense capability, but the plans drawn on their desks stretch far beyond that. The lessons of the Great War, global logistics, convoy escorts, long-range operations, are now woven into a single doctrine. Japan must never again rely on others for security or supply. You can almost hear the unspoken phrase beneath it. Never again be told where to stop. At night, the city glows like a beacon. Streetcars rattle down new avenues rebuilt after the earthquake. Movie theaters flash foreign titles. Jazz spills from rooftop bars. Tokyo feels cosmopolitan again, worldly, invincible. Yet beneath the laughter, the news grows darker. Reports of border skirmishes in Manchuria, of officers defying orders, of the army acting independently to protect Japanese interests. You realize the politicians no longer steer the ship, they're passengers now, clutching the rails while the tide decides the course. You pass a newspaper stand carrying bold headlines. Patriotic soldiers restore order in Manchuria. The editorials praise their initiative, calling it the destiny of Asia. You remember how, only a decade ago, the same word, destiny, was spoken in drawing rooms as philosophy. Now it's shouted in barracks as prophecy. Still, not everyone believes the drums. In cafes, professors argue for restraint. Writers warn that Japan risks repeating Europe's mistakes. One novelist says, "We build a garden of glass, beautiful, but ready to shatter at one stone." He's right, though few want to listen. The people are tired of doubt. Pride is easier than patience. You spend a quiet evening walking along the Sumida River. Lanterns float downstream, their lights mirrored in the dark water like scattered stars. For a moment, you can almost forget the politics and the noise. You think of the sailors who crossed the world to rescue strangers in 1917, the diplomats who asked for equality in 1919, the workers who rebuilt Tokyo from rubble. The story of modern Japan has been one long act of reaching, across oceans, across eras, across expectations. Historians still argue whether World War I made Japan or merely unmasked it. Maybe both. It turned a nation of islands into an empire of ideas, ambition, modernization, pride, and a hunger that success could never quite satisfy. The same drive that once built factories and fleets will, in time, drive tanks and planes. But for now, in this fragile calm between storms, the country stands at its highest point, bright, powerful, admired, and profoundly misunderstood. As the night deepens, you look toward the bay where destroyers sleep under the moonlight. Their hulls gleam silver, perfect and silent. You whisper to yourself, the world will soon remember them, not as guardians, but as ghosts. You close your eyes, hearing the faint clang of ship bells again, the eternal rhythm of industry and ambition. Somewhere in that sound lives the echo of a promise once made in good faith, that Japan would rise not to conquer, but to belong. And yet, like all promises tangled with pride, it has begun to change shape in the dark. Now the sea is calm again, the waves folding softly over one another like layers of silk. The factories rest, their chimneys pale against the dawn. You can almost imagine Tokyo breathing, slow, exhausted, unsure whether it has climbed a mountain or built one. History feels quieter here, its noise reduced to memory, its motion to the pulse of water against the shore. You let the story settle in your mind, how a small island nation entered a distant war, fought not for glory, but recognition, and found both more and less than it sought. You remember the sailors hauling men from the Mediterranean, the diplomats bowed under the chandeliers of Versailles, the workers who fed furnaces so bright they burned holes in the night. You realize every empire begins with the same heartbeat, the wish to be seen, and ends when that wish turns into hunger. The city outside your window fades into a blur of light. Somewhere, a radio hums a love song. Somewhere else, a factory siren calls men back to work. Time moves on, indifferent, yet forgiving. The lessons of the past drift beneath it like currents, waiting for anyone still listening. So breathe out. Let the engines quiet. Let the smoke clear. The story of Japan in the Great War isn't just about battles or treaties. It's about a nation learning what power feels like and what it costs to keep it. And as you drift towards sleep, think of that far horizon where ambition meets reflection, where every rising sun must one day rest. Sweet dreams.